Maya Rodriguez felt the cold metal floor against her cheek as consciousness slowly returned to her. The last thing she remembered was the blinding flash that had torn through the hull of the UES Meridian during what was supposed to be a routine patrol mission. Now she found herself in a place that definitely was not her ship. The air tasted different here. Heavier somehow, with a metallic tang that made her nose wrinkle. As her vision cleared, Maya realized she was not alone. 5 other members of her crew lay scattered around what appeared to be some kind of holding cell. The walls were a strange purple metal she had never seen before, and the lighting came from strips that ran along the ceiling in patterns that hurt her eyes to look at directly. Lieutenant Jake Morrison groaned from somewhere to her left. Maya turned her head carefully, testing for injuries. Her body ached, but everything seemed to be working properly. She had been lucky. Or perhaps their captors had been careful not to damage their prizes too badly. The cell door suddenly hissed open, with a sound like steam escaping from a pipe. Maya froze as creatures she had only imagined in nightmares stepped inside. They were massive, easily 8 feet tall, with thick, scaled skin that looked like it could stop bullets. Their heads were elongated, almost like crocodiles, but walking upright, and their arms were thick as tree trunks. Each finger ended in what looked like a black claw. The largest of these beings stepped forward and began speaking in a language that sounded like rocks grinding together. A moment later, a mechanical voice filled the air, translating his words into perfect English. "So, these are the creatures that call themselves humans," the voice said, though Maya could see the alien's mouth moving differently. "How disappointing! Look at how small they are, how weak their bodies appear to be." Another alien, this one with darker scales and strange markings around its eyes, stepped closer to examine the humans. "Commander Zexthel, surely these cannot be the beings that destroyed one of our scout ships. They look as if they would break if we simply touched them too firmly." The one called Zexthel reached down and grabbed Jake Morrison by the arm, lifting the 200-pound man as easily as Maya might lift a child. Jake groaned, but was still too dazed to resist. The alien held him up, turning him this way and that like he was examining a piece of fruit at a market. "Their bones feel hollow," Zexthel said, his translated words filled with disgust. "And this skin is so thin I can see the blood vessels beneath it. What kind of world produces such fragile creatures?" The other aliens made sounds that the translator did not convert, but Maya suspected they were laughing at Jake's expense. She remained still, keeping her breathing shallow and her eyes mostly closed, hoping they would think she was still unconscious. She had learned long ago that people revealed more when they thought no one was listening. Zexthel dropped Jake back to the floor without ceremony and moved toward Maya. She forced herself to remain limp as massive claws grabbed her arm and lifted her up. The alien's grip was like being held by a machine, completely without gentleness, but also precisely controlled. "This one is even smaller," Zexthel observed, and Maya could feel his breath on her face as he examined her. It smelled like rotten meat. Female of the species, perhaps. Look how tiny her frame is compared to even the smallest of their males. Her muscles are barely visible beneath that paper-thin skin. The dark-scaled alien stepped closer, and Maya felt another set of claws prodding at her shoulder and arm. I have never seen beings so poorly adapted for survival. How did they even develop space travel with such weak bodies? They must have evolved on a world with no predators and very low gravity. That would explain much, Zexthel agreed. No wonder they hide inside metal shells when they fight. These creatures could not survive a single blow from even our youngest warriors. Maya was fighting hard not to react as the aliens continued their examination. They poked and prodded at her like she was a laboratory specimen, commenting on every aspect of human physiology with a mixture of scientific curiosity and obvious contempt. Their reaction time appears slow, one alien noted as he waved a claw in front of Maya's face. And their sensory organs seem poorly developed. Small ears, small eyes, and that tiny nose. They must be nearly blind and deaf compared to proper beings. Perhaps that is why they were so easy to capture, the dark-scaled alien suggested. They probably never even saw our ships approaching until it was too late. Zexthel made a sound that definitely translated as amusement. It is almost cruel to kill such helpless creatures. It would be like crushing insects that pose no real threat. Maya felt herself being lowered back to the floor, and she was careful to collapse in a natural way that would not reveal her consciousness. The aliens continued their discussion above her, apparently assuming that none of the humans could understand them. "What shall we do with them, Commander?" the dark-scaled alien asked. The Empire's orders were to eliminate any humans we encountered, but these hardly seem worth the effort. "I am curious about their technology," Zexthel replied thoughtfully. "How did such weak creatures develop weapons capable of damaging our ships? Perhaps we should study them more carefully before disposing of them." "All of them, Commander." "No," Zexthel said, and Maya felt one of his claws tap against her shoulder. "This small female will serve as our test subject. She appears to be the weakest of the group, which makes her perfect for our experiments. Kill the others and dispose of them. I want to see exactly how fragile these humans really are." The aliens began moving toward the other crew members, and Maya heard the sound of some kind of weapon being powered up. She forced herself to remain completely still even as she heard Jake Morrison cry out in pain and fear. The translator was no longer working, or perhaps the aliens had simply stopped bothering with it. But the sounds that followed needed no translation. When the aliens finally left the cell, Maya was alone with the silence and the smell of death. She waited for what felt like hours, making sure they were really gone before she dared to open her eyes and assess her situation. The cell was now lit only by the strange ceiling strips, casting purple shadows that made everything look alien. And Maya sat up slowly, her mind already working on the problem before her. The aliens thought she was weak and fragile, a helpless creature from a soft world with no dangers. They had made the mistake of judging humanity by its appearance rather than its capabilities. Now they were going to learn exactly how wrong they were about what made humans dangerous. Maya spent the first hour after the aliens left simply sitting in the corner of her cell, letting her mind process everything she had observed. The Kethver, as she had heard them call themselves, had built this prison for beings their own size and strength. The bars were thick enough to stop a tank, and the locking mechanism looked like it required tremendous force to operate. For creatures like Zexthel and his warriors, this cell would be completely escape-proof, but Maya was not a Kethver warrior. She stood and began examining every inch of her prison with the methodical approach her engineering training had taught her. The walls were solid, seamlessly joined purple metal that showed no obvious weak points. The floor was the same material, perfectly smooth and apparently designed to prevent any kind of digging or prying. The ceiling, however, told a different story. Maya noticed that the lighting strips were not flush with the ceiling surface. There were tiny gaps around each strip, barely visible unless someone looked directly up at them from the right angle. More importantly, she could feel a slight movement of air coming from those gaps. Air meant ventilation, and ventilation meant passages that led somewhere else. The problem was reaching the ceiling. It was at least 12 feet high, far beyond her reach even if she jumped. But the cell's designers had made their first mistake in underestimating human flexibility and problem-solving ability. Maya began working with the only materials available to her. Her uniform was made of tough synthetic fabric designed to withstand the rigors of space travel. She carefully tore strips from the bottom of her shirt and began braiding them together into a makeshift rope. It was slow work, and her fingers were soon sore from the constant twisting and pulling, but she had nothing but time. While she worked, Maya listened carefully to the sounds of the ship around her. Every few hours, she heard the heavy footsteps of Kethver guards walking past her cell. Their steps were perfectly regular, suggesting they followed a strict patrol schedule. She also noticed that the ship's systems made different sounds at regular intervals, probably indicating shift changes or routine maintenance cycles. After several hours of work, Maya had created a rope that was almost 20 feet long. It was not pretty, and she was not entirely sure it would hold her weight, but it was her only option. She tied one end into a loop and began practicing throwing it at the light strips above. It took nearly 50 attempts before she managed to hook the loop around one of the strips. Maya tested the rope carefully, putting her full weight on it gradually. The light strip held, though it creaked ominously under the strain. She would have to move quickly once she started climbing. Maya pulled herself up hand over hand, her muscles burning from the effort. The aliens had been right about humans being physically weaker than their species, but they had failed to understand that weakness was relative. What they saw as pathetic strength was actually incredible efficiency. Her body was designed to do more with less, to survive on limited resources and adapt to changing conditions. When she reached the ceiling, Maya found that the gaps around the light strips were indeed connected to a ventilation system. The passages were far too small for a Kethver to navigate, probably too small even for a human to move through comfortably. But Maya had spent her childhood crawling through the maintenance tunnels of her family's mining station. Tight spaces did not frighten her. She carefully removed one of the light strips and squeezed herself into the passage beyond. The fit was incredibly tight, forcing her to move forward on her belly like a snake, but she could make progress. The aliens had never considered that their prisoners might be small and flexible enough to use their own ventilation system as an escape route. Maya crawled through the passages for what felt like hours, following the flow of air and the sounds of the ship's systems. Her fragile human joints proved to be far more flexible than Kethver anatomy would have allowed. She could bend and twist her body in ways that would have been impossible for the rigid-bodied aliens, squeezing through openings that they would never have imagined a living creature could navigate. Eventually, she found herself looking down through another ventilation grate into what appeared to be some kind of maintenance room. The chamber was filled with equipment she did not recognize, but the basic principles of engineering were universal. Every machine needed power, cooling, and some method of control, and Maya could see all of these elements in the systems below her. Maya waited and watched until she was certain the room was empty, then carefully removed the grate and dropped down into the chamber. Her landing was soft and quiet, another advantage of her low body weight that the aliens had dismissed as weakness. The maintenance room was clearly not designed for regular use by the ship's crew. The control panels were smaller and required more delicate manipulation than the systems she had observed the Kethver using elsewhere. This was probably automated equipment that rarely needed direct attention, which made it perfect for her purposes. Maya began examining the systems, using her engineering knowledge to understand their function. The universal principles of physics meant that even alien technology followed predictable patterns. Power flowed from generators to consumers, cooling systems moved heat from critical components, and control systems regulated the operation of everything else. She found what appeared to be environmental controls and began making careful adjustments. Maya did not want to cause obvious damage that would immediately alert the crew to her presence. Instead, she began making subtle changes that would create problems over time. She increased the humidity in some sections of the ship while decreasing it in others. She adjusted temperature controls to create uncomfortable conditions in crew quarters while leaving critical systems unaffected. The aliens thought they were dealing with a primitive creature from a soft world, but Maya had grown up in the harsh environment of a mining station where every system failure could mean death. She understood that the most dangerous problems were often the ones that developed slowly, creating cascading failures that were difficult to trace and even harder to fix. Maya spent hours in the maintenance room, learning as much as she could about Kethver technology while making her careful sabotage. She discovered that their systems were incredibly advanced but also incredibly dependent on automation. The aliens had built machines to do everything for them, which meant they had little experience with manual operation or improvised repairs. This dependence on technology was going to be their downfall. Maya's human adaptability and intuitive understanding of mechanical systems gave her advantages the Kethver could never have anticipated. While they saw only the intended function of their machines, she could see dozens of potential applications and failure points. When she finally crawled back through the ventilation system to her cell, Maya was exhausted but satisfied with her night's work. The aliens would soon begin experiencing mysterious equipment failures throughout their ship. They would waste time and resources trying to understand problems that seemed to have no logical cause. Maya replaced the light strip and destroyed her improvised rope, leaving no evidence of her escape. When the guards came by on their regular patrol, they would find her exactly where they expected her to be. Apparently still the helpless prisoner they thought they had captured, but Maya was no longer just a prisoner. She had become something far more dangerous, something the Kethver had no experience dealing with. She had become a human with nothing left to lose. Maya woke to the sound of frustrated alien voices echoing through the corridors outside her cell. Her sabotage from the previous night was already beginning to show results, and the Kethver crew was clearly not handling the unexpected problems well. Through the translator system that was apparently built into the ship itself, she could hear their complaints and confusion. "The environmental controls in Section 7 are malfunctioning again," one voice reported. "The humidity levels are far too high for comfortable operation." "That is the third system failure this cycle," another voice replied with obvious irritation. "Have the maintenance crews checked all the primary connections? Everything appears to be functioning within normal parameters, but the results are clearly wrong. It is as if the systems are operating correctly but producing incorrect outputs." Maya smiled to herself as she listened to their frustration. The aliens were trying to solve her sabotage using their standard procedures and logical thinking patterns, but human creativity did not follow their rules. She had made changes that would seem completely random to their systematic minds. Problems that could not be fixed simply by following a manual or running diagnostic programs. When the guards brought her daily meal, Maya observed them more carefully than before. The food was some kind of gray protein bar that tasted like cardboard, but it was edible and would keep her strength up. More importantly, she noticed that the guards themselves seemed uncomfortable and irritable. Her environmental changes were already affecting crew morale throughout the ship. The Kethver, who delivered her food, was smaller than Commander Zexthel, but still massive compared to Maya. He moved with the slow, deliberate motions she had observed in all members of their species, and she noticed that he seemed to be breathing more heavily than usual. The increased humidity in this section of the ship was making the aliens uncomfortable, just as she had planned. Maya spent the day observing and planning while pretending to be the helpless prisoner they expected her to be. She had learned that the Kethver followed rigid schedules and procedures for everything they did. Their guard rotations were perfectly regular, their maintenance checks followed exact protocols, and even their conversations seemed to follow predictable patterns. This adherence to routine would make them easy to predict and avoid. When the ship entered its night cycle and the corridors grew quiet, Maya once again made her escape through the ventilation system. This time she had specific destinations in mind, systems she had identified during her previous exploration that would cause maximum disruption with minimal risk of immediate detection. She found her way to what appeared to be the ship's main computer core, a massive chamber filled with processing units and data storage devices. The technology was far beyond anything humans had developed, but the basic principles were the same. Information flowed through circuits, programs controlled operations, and everything was connected through networks that could be accessed and modified. Maya began her work with the delicate touch of a surgeon. Rather than causing obvious damage, she began introducing subtle errors into the ship's data systems. She changed small values in navigation calculations, modified timing protocols by tiny amounts, and introduced minor inconsistencies into diagnostic routines. None of these changes would cause immediate failures, but they would gradually accumulate into major problems. The beauty of her approach was that each individual change was so small that it would not trigger any automatic error checking systems. The Kethver had built their computers to detect and correct major faults, but they had not anticipated someone who would deliberately introduce thousands of tiny problems that would interact with each other in unpredictable ways from the computer core. Maya moved to the ship's power distribution center. Here she found the systems that controlled energy flow to every part of the vessel. Again, she avoided making obvious changes that would immediately attract attention. Instead, she began adjusting power levels by small percentages, creating inefficiencies that would gradually drain the ship's energy reserves. While making certain systems work harder than necessary, Maya's human intuition guided her choices in ways that Kethver logic could never anticipate. Where they saw only the primary function of each system, she saw secondary and tertiary effects that could be exploited. A small change in power distribution could affect cooling efficiency, which could impact computer performance, which could cause errors in environmental controls, creating a cascade of problems that would be nearly impossible to trace back to. Their source, her next target, was the ship's communication systems. Maya did not want to completely disable their ability to communicate, as that would immediately alert them that they were under attack. Instead, she began introducing delays and distortions that would make their communications less reliable without being obviously sabotaged. She adjusted frequency modulation settings, modified error correction protocols, and introduced timing delays that would cause messages to arrive garbled or incomplete. As she worked, Maya began to understand more about Kethver psychology and behavior patterns. Their technology was incredibly sophisticated, but it had made them dependent and flexible. They had machines to think for them, to solve problems for them, and to make decisions for them. When those machines began producing unexpected results, the Kethvers seemed incapable of adapting quickly. This was the fundamental difference between their species and humanity. Humans had evolved on a world where survival required constant adaptation to changing conditions. They had learned to think creatively, to improvise solutions, and to see opportunities where others saw only obstacles. The Kethver had clearly evolved differently, developing incredible individual strength and advanced technology, but losing the flexibility that made humans truly dangerous. Maya spent the entire night moving through the ship's systems like a virus, spreading chaos and confusion wherever she went. She visited life support systems, artificial gravity generators, waste processing facilities, and dozens of other critical components. In each location, she made small changes that would interact with her previous sabotage to create increasingly complex problems. By the time she returned to her cell, Maya had introduced hundreds of small faults into the ship's operations. None of them would cause immediate catastrophic failure, but together they would create a nightmare of cascading malfunctions that would push the Kethver crew beyond their ability to cope. The next day brought exactly the results Maya had hoped. For the alien voices outside her cell were no longer just frustrated, they were beginning to sound genuinely worried. System failures were occurring throughout the ship, and each attempt to fix one problem seemed to create two more. The navigation. Computers are showing inconsistent readings, she heard one technician report. The stellar position calculations do not match the sensor data, but both systems claim to be functioning normally. Power consumption is up 17% from standard levels, another voice added. But we cannot locate the source of the additional drain. Every system shows normal power usage when tested individually. Communications with the fleet are becoming unreliable, a third voice contributed. Messages are being received with significant distortion, but our transmitters show no faults. Maya listened to their growing panic with satisfaction. The Kethver were discovering that their advanced technology was useless against an enemy who could think outside the parameters of their logical systems. They were trying to fight a human with alien methods, and they were losing badly. Commander Zexthal's voice eventually joined the chorus of complaints, and Maya could hear the strain in his translated words. How can so many systems fail simultaneously? Without any obvious cause, he demanded. Run complete diagnostics on every critical system and find the source of these malfunctions. But Maya knew they would find nothing. Her sabotage was too subtle, too distributed, and too creative for their systematic approach to detect. She had turned their own technology against them, using principles they could not understand or anticipate. The real beauty of her strategy was that it was only the beginning. Each night would bring new opportunities for sabotage, new ways to exploit their dependence on technology and rigid thinking. The Kethver thought they had captured a weak and helpless prisoner, but they had actually brought aboard the most dangerous predator in the galaxy, a human with nothing left to lose and the intelligence to use their own strengths against them. The morning of Maya's third day in captivity brought a change in the atmosphere. Aboard the Kethver ship that she could feel even from within her cell. The alien voices in the corridors had shifted from frustrated confusion to something approaching genuine fear. The cascade of system failures she had been orchestrating was beginning to overwhelm their ability to cope. And worse still, they were starting to suspect that their problems might not be accidental. Maya heard Commander Zextal speaking to his officers in urgent tones that needed no translation to understand. Even through the mechanical voice of the ship's translator, she could detect the strain and growing paranoia in his words. "These failures are not random," Zextal declared. "The pattern is too complex, too coordinated to be mere equipment malfunction. Someone or something is deliberately sabotaging our systems." "But, Commander," one of his subordinates replied, "we have searched every section of the ship multiple times. Our sensors detect no unauthorized presence, and all crew members have been accounted for at all times." "Then we have missed something," Zextal snapped. "Systems do not simply begin failing in perfect coordination without cause. There is an enemy aboard this vessel, and I want them found." Maya smiled grimly as she listened to their discussion. The aliens were finally beginning to understand that they were under attack, but they still had no idea who their enemy was or how she was moving through their ship undetected. Their rigid thinking patterns and dependence on technology were making it impossible for them to imagine that their supposedly helpless prisoner could be responsible for their troubles. That afternoon, Maya decided it was time to escalate her campaign from mere sabotage to active psychological warfare. She had learned enough about the ship's communication systems to access them from multiple points throughout the vessel, and she intended to use this knowledge to plant seeds of fear and doubt in the minds of her captors. When night fell and the corridors grew quiet, Maya once again made her escape through the ventilation system. This time, however, she had a very different destination in mind. She made her way to the ship's main communication center, where she could access not only the external communication arrays but also the internal announcement system that reached every part of the vessel. Maya spent several hours studying the communication protocols and learning how to mimic Kethver voice patterns through the ship's translation systems. It was delicate work that required her to understand not just the technical aspects of their equipment, but also the psychological triggers that would be most effective against their species. Finally, when she was confident in her preparation, Maya activated the ship's internal communication system and began broadcasting a message that would reach every Kethver aboard the vessel. "Warriors of the Kethver Empire," she said, her voice electronically modified to sound like one of their own people speaking in their native language. "You believe you hunt a helpless creature, but you are wrong. The human moves through your ship like a shadow, striking where you least expect, turning your own technology against you." Maya paused, listening to the sounds of sudden activity that her broadcast had triggered throughout the ship. She could hear alien voices shouting in confusion and alarm, heavy footsteps running through corridors, and the sound of weapons being activated. "She knows your routines, your weaknesses, your fears," Maya continued. "While you sleep, she crawls through the spaces you cannot reach, learning your secrets and preparing your destruction. The hunter has become the hunted, and you do not even know you are her prey." Before the Kethver could trace her signal, Maya cut the transmission and quickly moved to a different location. The psychological effect of her message would be far more damaging than any physical sabotage she could perform. The aliens were now forced to confront the reality that their prisoner was not only free, but actively hunting them aboard their own vessel. Over the following days, Maya began implementing a campaign of targeted harassment designed to break down the Kethver crew's morale and effectiveness. She had observed their behavioral patterns long enough to know which individuals were most important to the ship's operation and which ones were most vulnerable to Psychological pressure, she began leaving evidence of her presence in strategic locations throughout the ship. A piece of torn fabric from her uniform left in the personal quarters of the ship's chief engineer. Scratch marks made by her fingernails on the door of the weapons control center. Small items moved or rearranged in ways that could not be accidental, but provided no obvious threat. Each piece of evidence was carefully placed to suggest that Maya had been in locations where her presence should have been impossible to achieve undetected. The cumulative effect was to make the Kethver crew feel that nowhere aboard their own ship was safe from the human they had so badly underestimated. Maya also began targeting individual crew members for more personal psychological attacks. She learned their names and schedules, then used the ship's communication system to deliver personalized messages that demonstrated her intimate knowledge of their daily routines and personal habits. "Engineer Caxwell," she would whisper through the speakers in his quarters, "I watched you work on the power distribution grid today. Your hands shake when you think no one is looking. How long before that shaking causes a fatal mistake?" The effect on crew morale was devastating. The Kethver were a species bred for direct confrontation and physical combat, but they had no experience dealing with an enemy who attacked their minds rather than their bodies. Maya's psychological warfare was more effective than any weapon she could have used against them. Commander Zexthal attempted to maintain discipline and order among his crew, but Maya could see that even he was beginning to show signs of strain. His commands became more erratic, his temper shorter, and his decision-making less reliable. The steady pressure of her campaign was breaking down the command structure of the entire vessel. Maya's human endurance proved to be another crucial advantage in her war against the Kethver. While they required long periods of rest and recovery, she could operate on minimal sleep for days at a time. She could sustain physical and mental effort for far longer than their physiology would allow, keeping up constant pressure that gave no opportunity to adapt or recover. The aliens began organizing hunting parties to search for her, but Maya's superior knowledge of the ship's layout and her ability to move through spaces they could not access made her nearly impossible to catch. She could observe their search patterns, predict their movements, and always stay one step ahead of their efforts. More importantly, the time and resources they spent hunting for her were time and resources not spent on maintaining their ship or completing their mission. Every hour they devoted to searching for her was an hour in which her sabotage continued to accumulate, creating new problems faster than they could solve the old ones. Maya began picking off isolated crew members when opportunities arose, not killing them outright, which would have provided the clarity of direct combat that the Kethver understood, but incapacitating them in ways that added to the atmosphere of fear and confusion aboard the ship. A technician found unconscious in a maintenance tunnel with no memory of how he got there. A guard discovered tied up in his own quarters with evidence that someone had spent hours watching him sleep. Each incident reinforced the message that the human prisoner they had dismissed as weak and helpless was, in fact, a predator, far more dangerous than anything in their experience. Maya was not just escaping. She was systematically dismantling their ability to function as a military unit while demonstrating that she could reach any of them at any time she chose. The psychological pressure finally broke one of the younger crew members, who began babbling about the ghost human that stalked the corridors at night. His fear was contagious, spreading through the crew like a disease and undermining the discipline that held their military structure together. Commander Zexthal was forced to face the reality that his ship was no longer under his control. The human he had planned to study and dissect had instead become the dominant predator aboard his own vessel, and he had no idea how to fight an enemy that seemed to exist everywhere and nowhere at once. Maya had been aboard the Kethver ship for 8 days when she finally decided it was time to end the game. Her systematic sabotage had reduced the once mighty warship to a floating collection of failing systems, held together by the increasingly desperate efforts of a demoralized crew. But sabotage and psychological warfare had served their purpose. Now it was time for the final move that would either secure her freedom or ensure that her captors paid the ultimate price for their arrogance. She had spent the previous night making her way to the ship's engineering section, the heavily protected heart of the vessel where the main power systems and structural controls were located. Getting there had required all of her accumulated knowledge of the ship's layout and the guard rotation schedules she had memorized over the past week. The engineering section was far more secure than the areas Maya had accessed before, with multiple layers of protection and monitoring systems that would normally make unauthorized entry impossible. But the Kethver had designed their security to stop creatures like themselves. Not a small human who could squeeze through maintenance passages and override electronic locks with improvised tools. Maya found herself in a vast chamber dominated by the ship's main power core, a massive structure that pulsed with contained energy. Around it were arranged the control systems that regulated every aspect of the ship's operation, from life support to artificial gravity to the engines that propelled them through space. This was the nervous system of the entire vessel, and Maya intended to give it a stroke. She began her work with the methodical precision her engineering training had taught her, but with a creativity that no Kethver could have imagined. Instead of simply destroying the power core, which would have caused an explosion that killed her along with everyone else, Maya began rerouting power flows in ways that would create cascading feedback loops throughout the ship's systems. Maya connected power conduits that were never meant to be connected, creating electrical pathways that would overload critical components throughout the ship. She modified the magnetic containment systems that held the power core stable, not enough to cause immediate failure, but enough to create dangerous instabilities that would grow worse over time. Most importantly, she began programming the ship's own computers to assist in its destruction. The beauty of Maya's approach was that she was using the ship's incredible complexity against itself. The Kethver had built a vessel so advanced and interconnected that failure in one system would inevitably cascade into failures throughout the entire ship. Maya simply had to create the right initial conditions, and the ship would essentially tear itself apart. She worked through the night with the focused intensity of someone who knew this was their last chance at survival. Every connection she made, every program she modified, every system she sabotaged was calculated to contribute to a single goal: the complete destruction of the Kethver warship and everyone aboard it except herself. As dawn approached, Maya made her final preparations. She programmed a delay into her sabotage that would give her time to reach the ship's escape pods before the cascade began. Then she activated the sequence and began making her way through the ship one last time. The first sign of Maya's final gambit came as a low vibration that seemed to run through the entire structure of the ship. Within minutes, that vibration had become a noticeable shaking, and emergency alarms began sounding throughout the vessel. Maya listened to the growing panic in the alien voices as she moved through corridors toward her destination. Power fluctuations in all primary systems, one voice reported with barely controlled fear. Magnetic containment is showing dangerous instabilities. The computer core is reporting cascade failures throughout the network, another added. Every time we try to correct one problem, 3 more appear. It is accelerating, a third voice shouted over the growing sound of structural stress. Whatever is happening, it is getting worse faster than we can compensate. Maya reached the escape pod bay just as Commander Zexthal's voice echoed through the ship's communication system, his translated words heavy with the realization of his defeat. All crew to emergency stations, he commanded, but Maya could hear the despair in his voice. Prepare for immediate evacuation. The ship is experiencing total systems failure. The escape pod bay was in chaos as Kethver crew members rushed to reach the limited number of escape vessels. Maya watched from the shadows as the massive aliens struggled with equipment designed for their own species, their panic making them clumsy and inefficient. She had counted on this confusion to mask her own escape attempt. Maya slipped into an escape pod while the aliens were distracted by their own evacuation efforts. The pod's controls were sized for Kethver hands, but her human dexterity allowed her to operate systems that the panicked aliens were fumbling with in their haste. She sealed the pod and began the launch sequence. Just as the ship's structural failures reached a critical point, through the pod's viewport, Maya watched as the massive Kethver warship began tearing itself apart exactly as she had planned. Explosions blossomed along its hull as overloaded power systems failed catastrophically. Sections of the ship broke away as structural supports buckled under forces they were never designed to handle. The vessel that had seemed so invincible when she was first brought aboard was now dying from wounds inflicted by its own technology. "Commander." Zexthal's voice reached her through the pod's communication system one final time, and Maya could hear both rage and grudging respect in his translated words. "Human," he said, speaking directly to her, though he could not know which escape pod she occupied. "I underestimated your species completely. You have destroyed the most advanced warship in the Kethver fleet using nothing but your primitive cunning and the tools we provided." Maya activated her pod's transmitter to respond, knowing this would likely be the last conversation she would ever have with a member of the species that had murdered her crewmates. "You made the mistake of judging us by our appearance instead of our capabilities," she replied. "Humans did not become the dominant species on Earth by being the strongest or the fastest. We survived because we could adapt, because we could think, and because we never gave up no matter how hopeless things seemed." "What kind of world creates creatures like you?" Zexthal asked, his voice filled with a mixture of horror and fascination. "A world where everything is trying to kill you," Maya answered. "A world where the weather can freeze you solid or burn. You alive, where the ground can shake apart beneath your feet, where creatures with toxins and diseases and parasites hunt anything that shows weakness. You called us fragile, but we are the survivors of the most dangerous planet in the galaxy." The Kethva warship exploded in a brilliant flash that temporarily blinded the sensors of Maya's escape pod. When the light faded, nothing remained but scattered debris and the fading energy signatures of other escape pods fleeing the destruction. Maya had accomplished what an entire human fleet might have struggled to achieve. She had single-handedly destroyed one of the most powerful ships in the alien empire. Maya programmed her pod to broadcast a distress signal on human frequencies, and settled in to wait for rescue. She knew that word of what had happened here would spread throughout both human and alien space, carrying a message that no species could afford to ignore. Humanity had been dismissed as weak and primitive by beings who measured strength only in terms of physical power and technological advancement. But they had learned too late that humans possessed something far more dangerous than strong bodies or advanced weapons. They possessed the intelligence to turn any environment into an advantage, the creativity to find solutions where others saw only problems, and the absolute determination to never surrender no matter how overwhelming the odds. 3 days later, Maya was picked up by a human patrol ship that had detected her distress beacon. The crew listened in amazement as she described how she had escaped from Kethver captivity and destroyed their warship using nothing but human ingenuity and their own technology against them. News of Maya's achievement spread quickly through human space and beyond. The story of the small human female who had been captured and dismissed as helpless, only to systematically destroy her captors using their own arrogance against them, became a legend that inspired human forces throughout the galaxy. More importantly, it carried a warning to every alien species that might consider humanity an easy target. The message was simple but profound: never underestimate a species that had clawed its way to the top of the food chain on a world where everything was trying to kill them. Humans might appear fragile and weak by alien standards, but they were the survivors of Earth, and Earth did not produce weaklings. The Kethver Empire, when they learned what had happened to their warship, faced a choice that would define their future relationship with humanity. They could continue to see humans as primitive creatures to be conquered and enslaved, or they could recognize them as the most dangerous predators in the galaxy. Maya Rodriguez had given them a demonstration of human capabilities that could not be ignored or explained away. She had proven that when humans were pushed to their limits, when they had nothing left to lose and everything to fight for, they became something that even the most advanced